Well, hello everyone. Good evening from Boston, Massachusetts. My name is Jonathan McLatchie, and I'm here with my friend Steve McRae, who is an agnostic thinker whom you might have come across through the Non Sequitur show or through his YouTube content. And I've been following Steve McRae for some time on social media, and like a lot of his content. I agree with him on quite a bit, and I also admire and respect him in some aspects, such as his willingness to critique people on his own side of the fence, which I think is very noble, and love to see more people doing that. And so I reached out to Steve on Facebook and asked him if he would be willing to come and have a dialogue with me on my channel, basically to explore why I am a Christian, why he's not a Christian, and areas where we might have common ground as well in terms of epistemology and other areas. So thanks so much, Steve, for being with us today.
And thank you for the invite. I'm actually very honored to be on here speaking with you. I've known of you for many years actually, but we've never really had much of a dialogue other than passing on Facebook before. So I really do appreciate this opportunity.
Yeah, it's been great. It's great to have you here. So I thought maybe we could start with some short introductions. Do you want to say a little bit about your background for those that maybe haven't come across you before? What's your religious background? Where do you stand currently on religious questions and so forth?
Of course. My upbringing has basically been non-religious. My mom is Jewish. My dad was Protestant. My brother was Jehovah's Witness. My family is all over the place, but I really wasn't raised in a religious household per se. Occasionally during Thanksgiving, we'd have like a prayer or something like that, but not very often. And then when I turned 17, I got involved in the Mormon church because my friends through most of my life that I was involved with were members of the LDS church. And I took the lessons. And of course, I had some things happen to me that I seemed to relate to that being a spiritual experience. And then therefore I got baptized. And about, I don't know, 6 months later, I joined the military and didn't really have much interactions with the church, much with religion. I kind of fell away. And then about 2008, California had a proposition, Prop 8, that was against gay marriage. And that to me was kind of a final straw that I just couldn't imagine a church funding something when it came to these kind of secular things being against, where I felt that they had no business being in those kind of political things. And I thought if God exists and God is, somehow the true church and the God is actually saying that this is something that we should be giving money against, it didn't make much sense to me. And I just kind of lost all theistic positions after that.
Interesting. And so it wasn't so much an argument for you to begin with that
Nope.
convinced you of non-belief?
No, I mean, I'm familiar with the arguments, but none of them really convinced me. I mean, I do think they're interesting. I think that the ontological arguments are interesting. I think that the modal ontological argument from Plantinga is interesting, but none of them really convinced me. They're just, hey, look, they're weak evidence, is what I call it, weak argumentation. And I don't mean weak as in bad. I just mean it's not like a strong case for. And so people can use them to kind of support or buttress their existing beliefs. And I think that's the case. I think a lot of theists actually use a lot of religious arguments, whether it be cosmological, ontological, transcendental arguments, to kind of support their already existing positions. I don't know too many theists that said, hey, you know what? Here's the cosmological argument. I'm going to believe in God one day. There's so many nuances of what the concepts of God are, and so many nuances for religion, that it would seem incoherent for me for somebody to say, hey, look, I'm going to pick this particular one because the Kalam says if there's a beginning, there's a God, kind of thing.
Cool. And what do you do on a day-to-day basis? What do you do for a living?
I live full-time off YouTube. I have my own channel now. Well, I've had it for quite some time, since 2013, called Steve McRae. I also had a Great Debate Community channel, which is kind of defunct, that I use for kind of gaming. And then I had the Non Sequitur show with my partner, Kyle Curtis, who unfortunately decided to take the show, take all the money. I've been in litigation with him for almost 2 years now, trying to resolve that issue. I've already won the case. It's just a matter of him being found for criminal and civil contempt, which is going to happen sometime next month, I believe.
Excellent. And what was your educational background?
I was a Navy nuke. I went to Naval Nuclear Power School, so I learned how to operate nuclear power plants. I went to Texas A&M Extension for macro and microeconomics and college algebra. Then I attended local college for a whole bunch of classes, like everything from history and English to informal logical fallacies. I took computer programming, physics. I took biology. It was, one of those situations where you just wanted to take to learn kind of stuff. And so I never finished my degree, although I obtained over 120 credits. And in California, I think you need 124 for a bachelor's, give or take. So I'm not quite there, but they're all over the place. And you know how accreditation is, man. If you don't take this one course for this one pipeline, they're like, nope, you don't get it. So
yeah, I have a very similar attitude. I love to learn for the sake of learning. I'm currently doing a master's degree at Southern Evangelical Seminary in Biblical Studies, and I'm also taking a course currently through Harvard in bioinformatics, which is at their extension school. So as to my background, my name is Jonathan McLatchie. For those that are new here, I am Christian, scholar. I have a PhD in evolutionary biology. I'm also interested in biblical scholarship, especially New Testament studies. And I've done various debates and various lectures on different topics involving the intersection of science and faith, or theology, New Testament studies, that type of thing. You can find my website at jonathanmclatchie.com, where I publish various articles on different apologetics themed topics. So I thought perhaps we could talk a little bit about our respective epistemologies and where we perhaps agree or disagree on that before getting into specifics of where we disagree with respect to worldview. So where would you say you're at in terms of epistemology? How would you, what would you say is the basis of epistemic justification or epistemic warrant for you?
I do tend to classical foundationalism. I do tend to Plantinga's version of a properly basic belief, although I think he identifies certain things as properly basic that are not. But overall, classical foundationalism is the position that you have foundational beliefs from which you can therefore infer other beliefs from, right? So these properly basic beliefs are non-inferential. They're dostastically inferential. There's something that are just the bedrock of our beliefs that we start with, axiomatic assumptions, so to speak. I think that's just one approach. I don't necessarily say that there's any specific approach to having an epistemic justification that you must adhere to at all times. I think there's reasons why people will go to coherentism and things of that nature. But for me, I just find that we must start with certain things that we just have to have assumptions for, presuppositions. And that's not, by the way, presuppositional apologetics. That is just presuppositions that we have to say, look, there's no evidence either way. I mean, any evidence for one is evidence for the other side. And we just have to assume. That's like, for example, like the reality is external to the mind, that other minds exist. These things are not demonstrable in either way, whether that's true or false. It's just, we have to make certain assumptions.
Great. So I would also adhere to classical foundationalism. So we're very much on the same page there. And how would you define evidence? Would you define it as a Bayesian? So as a Bayesian, I would define evidence as that which is more probable given your hypothesis than given the falsity of your hypothesis. Would that be essentially aligned with your view?
Yeah, from a scientific point of view, there's two ways I actually use evidence, because there is more of a colloquial usage of it. Evidence in the scientific sense or the mathematical is exactly what you said. It's basically what is going to adjust the likelihood that your hypothesis is true, okay, or false. I mean, it's just going to give weight to what you think is the case, and I'm fine with that. I think that is a proper way to define evidence. However, I also will use evidence as what you proffer to somebody for evaluation. And I know a lot of people have a lot of issue with that because they say, well, the Bible is the claim, the Bible is not the evidence. Well, I disagree with that. I think that if a theist says, look, my claim is that God exists and I'm using the Bible in support of that to buttress that, I have no problem with that. Now, I will say, if they say the Bible is true because the Bible says it's true, that is, of course, it is circular. Nobody should probably think otherwise of that, but I don't think that's the claim that they make. And so I think evidence would be something along the lines of when we have these kind of colloquial discussions is, what am I offering to you to sway you to change your position on it, right? What are you evaluating in terms of what I have to offer, whether it be some kind of logical argument or rationalization or something along those lines, because it is not always evidential, right? It's not always empiricism. It's not always me saying, hey, look, here is an experiment that you can do. A lot of times it could be here, oh, here's a rational, argument for it, or here's a logical argument for something. And I think a lot of people discount that. They want to put everything in terms of scientism. And I know people will say that word doesn't exist, but it does. And I think that they misuse the scientific method to justify their epistemology.
Yeah, that claim that, or that contention that the Bible is the claim, not the evidence, or the claims are not evidence, I think is a very popular atheist talking point, but it's very naive, I think, philosophically or epistemologically, because propositional claims obviously are not evidence, but testimonial claims are. They might be weak evidence, but they are nonetheless evidence. And the extent to which they are evidence will vary with the context, of course. So, for instance, if you have a friend that's trusted and that they have a track record of being habitually truthful, when they assert something to be true, that is pretty good evidence that it is in fact true. It's prima facie, so it could be overturned by contrary evidence, but at least at the prima facie level, it is pretty good reason to accept the proposition is true. And of course, you have to factor in the prior probability. So if they tell you that they can turn invisible or fly or something, well, that's got a very low prior probability. So that would need to also be factored in. You would need more evidence to justify something with a low prior probability, of course. So I think we would see eye to eye on that.
Yeah, real quick. I think along the lines of we trust people given their priors, right? Doesn't mean that their statement is true, but it would be more likely to me to be the case if somebody that I know very well came to me and said, "Hey, look, Steve, I bought a dog today." Yeah. I'm going to go, "Okay, great." I'm not going to really question that. I'm not going to be dubious towards that. Right. But even still, if somebody that I really know very well and they say, "Look, man, I was out fishing yesterday and this spaceship came over my head." I'm going to believe that they did experience something, right? I don't think they're lying to me per se. I'm going to accept that there's something experiential there. I'm going to maybe just doubt their conclusion because I cannot step into their shoes, right? My experience is different from them. I don't know what it's like to experience their experiences and how they formulate their conclusion. But I can say, look, I think this person did experience something. Whether we differ on the reasoning, that's fine. But it is, like you said, based upon priors. If I know a person who continually lies and it's all they do is lie or lie frequently, they could tell me the sky is blue and I'm going to walk outside to make sure that it's blue, right?
Right, exactly. So we agree then that the extent to which a piece of evidence is sufficient evidence will be contingent on the prior probabilities. And you would agree, presumably, that no matter how low the prior probability, provided it's not zero, it can in principle be overcome with sufficient evidence. Would you agree with that?
Correct. If something's not impossible, right? And what I mean by impossible, I literally mean it as cannot exist in any possible world. If something is logically possible, it must exist in at least one possible world, but not all of them. Well, it doesn't have to be all of them unless it's a metaphysical necessity, but it has to at least exist in one. And so a lot of people confuse that. They were like, well, it's impossible for like Jesus to have rose from the dead. Well, that's not a biological claim, though. It is impossible biologically, but that's the whole point. It was supposed to be a miracle, right? But is that logically impossible? No, that's nothing logically impossible about that. And in some possible world, we all rose from the dead.
Right. So you would agree that in principle, testimonial evidence could be sufficient to establish the resurrection, at least in principle, right?
To some degree. I mean, in principle, sure, in theory. And again, testimonial evidence is, as you said, a very weak form of evidence. But again, their conclusions might be faltered, and that's something we must take into account. It's even if we believe the testimony, even if we believe these people are very sincere about what they saw, what they claim to be the case, doesn't mean that their conclusion necessarily follows, right? And so I'm willing to concede that a lot of people have had experiences. I've had experiences. You probably have had experiences. We all probably have some things that we just cannot explain. But does it conclude a necessity for a deity or specifically Christianity? I don't see that. I don't see how that follows. I can't make that jump to say, okay, these are the things that we've experienced. These people have claimed they've seen certain things. Ergo, that those must be the conclusion that they came to, especially in light of things that we know now. We obviously have a lot deeper understanding of reality than we did 2,000 years ago, and things that back then they might not have interpreted in the same way that somebody would today. I mean, you and I have, if we have a lucid dream today, they might have interpreted that as a vision 2,000 years ago, right?
Right. So the way that I would personally proceed to make the case for, let's say, the resurrection, which is probably a good place to start as being the core linchpin behind undergirding the Christian faith is the way I would argue the case is to say that when anyone makes any claim, any testimonial claim, there are three categories of explanation that could account for that testimonial claim. One is that the person making the claim lied deliberately, set out to deceive people. One is that they were honestly mistaken somehow, and the other is that they're telling the truth. I would argue these are mutually exhaustive. Sure, they're broad categories of explanation, but they are mutually exhaustive. And by showing the implausibility of the deceit hypothesis and the honest mistaken hypothesis, one can provide confirmatory support for the third contending hypothesis, namely that they were actually correct in what they assert. Would you agree with that, at least in principle? That's strong argument.
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
Yeah. So would you agree that the apostles made claims concerning the resurrection?
Yeah, I believe that the apostles existed to a certain extent. I from what I understand, Peter has some questions about attestation, but for the most part, I think that they existed. I'm not a mythicist. I think that there probably was somebody named Jesus. I think that there was probably some kind of following. I don't think that's too far-fetched. I don't think that we even have to even go to the extent of saying that, okay, nothing in the Bible is correct. Right. I think that's like throwing out the baby with the bathwater kind of thing.
Sure. And would you agree that the apostles actually claimed that Jesus had been raised from the dead and appeared to them? Or in other words, that they claimed to have had personal encounters with the risen Jesus, irrespective of what
from what I'm by the way, my Bible knowledge is fairly low. Sure. So just put that on the table there. I'm no one to go to ask about the Bible. But from what I understand, they did have experiences, although their experiences were different, especially afterwards. There's the canonical Gospels, then you have one that completely is different as far as experiences. But yeah, I mean, they all testified in some degree that they experienced something that we would consider to be probably out of the norm.
Right. And I think that there's some pretty good support for that for listeners that aren't familiar. In 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, for example, where Paul gives the text that many scholars think is an ancient creed from the early church. So what I received, I pass on to is the first importance that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised again on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. He appeared to Cephas and to the 12 and to James and to all the apostles, last of all, he appeared to me also as to one untimely born. Even if that, I have an article on my website where I discuss in detail, review in detail the scholarship on 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, basically evaluating the arguments pro and con for that text being a creed. And I basically come to the conclusion that it's more likely than not that it's a creed, although I think that I wouldn't argue that it's sure beyond a reasonable doubt that it is of creedal origin. But even if most scholars are wrong on that particular point, when you get to verse 11, I think you have an even stronger argument, because in verse 11, Paul says, whether then it was I or they, so he preached and so he believed. And so in other words, what Paul is now preaching to the Corinthians concerning the resurrection of Jesus, that had already been proclaimed by the other apostles, in particular Peter and James and the 12. And we have independent reason to think that the Corinthians were acquainted with the preaching of Peter, because in 1 Corinthians 1, Paul mentions that there were divisions and factions in their midst. Some say, I follow Cephas, others I follow Apollos, others I follow Paul, others I follow Christ. So that creed in 1 Corinthians 15, especially in view of what Paul says in verse 11, suggests, I think, quite strongly that this claim of the resurrection actually goes back to the apostles. It's not a later developing legend that the apostles knew nothing about, right? I think you would agree.
No, I think it's contemporary. I don't think that was something after the fact.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. And then I think the next stage in the argument would be to investigate what the original apostles were claiming. What was the nature of the resurrection encounters with the risen Jesus? And I would argue that the character or nature, the variety of the resurrection encounters with Jesus were such that it makes it enormously improbable that they were honestly mistaken in their testimony. So if the Gospels and Acts are indeed based on substantially trustworthy eyewitness testimony, then and that's conditional, then we would have to take seriously what they say concerning the nature and variety of the resurrection encounters, including its polymodal or multisensory character, involving not just sight, but group sightings, group conversations with Jesus, eating breakfast with Jesus on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And according to Acts chapter 1, it was extended across a 40-day time period. So it wasn't just a brief and confusing episode. If the Gospels and Acts are indeed based on eyewitness testimony, that would be something very difficult to be honestly mistaken about. Would you agree with that?
No, I would disagree. I think that people have historically misidentified things. I mean, throughout history, we thought certain things were the case, and then later on, we discovered more about the topic and go, okay, that wasn't our initial conjecture about it. And I think that when it came to 2,000 years ago, of course, they don't know the things that we know now, and they did probably see things that they didn't see before. They saw things that we see now, but they've ascribed them differently. For example, we know about the what is it called, the Nazareth Effect, right? We know people have, and I'm not saying this happened with Jesus, by the way, but I'm just saying that we know people that appear to be dead and came back. And by the way, how many people wasn't in the Bible that came back? It wasn't more than, it was like 4 or something. It wasn't just Jesus. Other people have came back as well from the dead. And in fact, some pastors, again, not a Bible person, but the graves opened up and people came out of the graves and walked. But we don't see that nowadays. And my argument is this, if Jesus is the Son of God and God does exist, and there's somebody like myself who what I call a non-resistant non-believer. It's typical for what's called the problem of divine hiddenness. Why doesn't God, do these things nowadays? Why is there such silence? The argument from silence kind of thing. Why is it that we don't see these things happening when we have a pandemic like we just had? We don't attribute that to God nowadays. Now, not saying that there aren't certain people that do, but those are considered to be fringe, obviously, because we understand that, and as a biologist, you know exactly how viruses work. You know exactly how these things take place. And so we understand that it wasn't some plague by God. We understand that it was a natural phenomenon. And I think over time, we've discovered natural explanations for natural phenomena, which is the whole basis for science. Now, that doesn't mean there's things that we haven't understood yet. I'm not even claiming naturalism. I would argue that overall, we have discovered more naturalistic explanations for things once thought supernatural than finding any supernatural, because we have zero priors on that. And I'm not against having a supernatural causation if we can see it, right? And again, not for science per se, but in the realm of philosophy. And so why wouldn't God just reveal himself? I mean, if he revealed himself to people 2,000 years ago, then there's no reason why he wouldn't now. We can't just say it's all faith-based, because, it's more than just faith back then. They had, empirical evidence. They had, evidential evidence. They had visual, confirmation of these things. And even though they may or may not understood it properly, I don't see people having confirmation of that nowadays. Some may claim it, but for the most part, we don't see any kind of worldwide consilience of stories, right? Everybody's stories, what they say when they seem to have an experience with God, is completely different from every other story.
Sure. So your primary objection would be relating to the priors, correct?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has the priors. So again, we when we're talking about priors, we have a lot of priors that we've discovered naturalistic explanations for things. And again, I want to make it clear, I'm not advocating for an ontological or methodological naturalism. I do adhere to methodological, I don't adhere to ontological and metaphysical naturalism, but I do think that methodological naturalism is the way to go for science. But we have to recognize that we have explanations for things. And I think that us as sentient beings, we want explanations. I think it's hardwired into us, whether it's from biological or sociological, whatever the reasons are. We want explanations. We don't like not knowing things. Our brains are wired to even fill in the blanks if it doesn't apprehend something properly. Illusions, for example, or pareidolia, things that the mind will fill in the gaps with. And so a lot of this, I think, is hardwired for us to come up with an explanation for things. And I think God is a possible metaphysical accounting for things, a possible logical explanation. Again, when an atheist says that God is illogical, they have a huge burden to overcome on that. But because they have to actually prove using logic that is modally impossible. But I don't think that's significant enough to say, okay, this is the case, right? And so, I don't hold that position because I don't think it suffices to say God is the metaphysical accounting. I think the most I can get to as an agnostic is to say it is possible that God is an accounting, and I don't find it to be that far-fetched, but I don't see a lot of good argumentations for why it just is a metaphysical accounting from theists. What I see is, like, unfortunately, a lot of it is just, testimonial evidence, right? It's, well, the prophets, the apostle said this, but to me, if somebody's going to promote the idea that God exists, it really should become more from a metaphysical point of view, a metaphysical accounting of why we are here. That's, at least that's from my perspective. I'm not going to be convinced because of testimony. God would know that. But I would be convinced if we had a solid, rock solid argument to say, look, God has to exist, right? If God has to exist, I'm like, okay, well, this is pretty logical then, right? But to my knowledge, no such proof exists. There's some weak arguments out there, but there's no rock solid ones. Does that make sense?
Sure. So, how would you go about prior estimation for some? I mean, do you think that one could, for example, argue in principle from messianic prophecy and fulfillment of Hebrew scripture, so that sort of religio-historical context, to borrow an expression from William Craig? Do you think that one could, in principle, do such an argument to argue that God plausibly has motivation for raising Jesus of Nazareth specifically from the dead? And so the prior probability in Jesus' case is higher significantly than the prior probability for any miscellaneous random Joe Blow.
I don't see why it would be higher. I mean, we've never experienced anything like that before, right? We for all practical purposes, we've never seen anybody come back from 3 days being dead. We've never seen anybody perform a miracle. I mean, in fact, when we see people doing healing, we've always recognized that, you know, they're fake healers. I mean, even you would have to, I'm sure, agree. There's a lot of fake healers out there. There's people out there that prey on people, that tell them, hey, don't take your medication and you'll be healed, and have faith in God. And then they stop taking their medication. And then when that adrenaline rush leaves, and they leave, and they start feeling awful again. And then they're told, hey, look, you know, you just didn't have enough faith. I mean, these people they prey on that kind of people. And so I don't see any priors where we've seen any kind of real faith healing or faith-based type things come to fruition. Not saying that it can't happen. And if it does happen, it probably happens very privately. Because again, if God wanted to demonstrate his abilities, he could do so in many different fashions. And so I don't know why he would do it through somebody that we all know would be a dishonest person who is doing things dishonestly to make a buck. I'm not going to mention any specific names, but sure we could come up with quite a few off the bat. And so I think that, yeah, you could probably justify it to oneself the way you described it, but it wouldn't justify it to me, and I don't think it's justifiable to somebody else. I don't know how you would use testimony evidence just like that to somebody else say, look, this is the case because these people said so, regardless of what it is.
Do you think that a frequentist approach of observing the frequencies of occurrence is the best or the only way to determine prior probability?
Yeah, you know, I got to tell you, when we start getting into frequentists and stuff like that for all the Bayesian stuff, it's way over my head. I do know that people have dived into that. I have a good friend that I really like called Sisyphus Redeemed. Well, I mean, he's not a great friend, but I mean, he's somebody I know really well. And he's all into that kind of analysis. I'm not, and so I don't really have an opinion on that per se. I think he does tend to frequentism. But it's not an analysis that I would be able to actually try to even ascertain whether the validity of it is the way to go for Bayesian.
Sure, it's just because the way that you had attempted to argue that the priors are astronomically small for the resurrection is because we don't.
Yeah, what is it called? There's two types of priors. There's the posterior priors.
Well, the posterior probability is the calculation of the final probability.
Probabilities from the priors. Okay. I just think it is, if we have low priors, it would mean we have low observations of them, low experiences with them. All right. I mean, again, I think you would agree that in modernity, we probably don't have experiences like they had in the Bible, according to what they saw, right? We don't have, water turning into wine. We don't have, people rising from the dead, from the graves. I mean, I got to tell you, right now, if there was a cemetery and all the people started rising out of it, people would take pause. Right. I think a lot of people would be like, okay, I mean, that would convince a lot of people, whether it be true or not, whether, because God did it, it still would probably turn a lot of people. A lot of people at least have to take pause and go, okay, I don't think there's a naturalistic explanation here, or at least something that is so beyond our understanding that we wouldn't be able to explain it in any kind of natural means.
And as a Christian, we would argue that miracles like the resurrection, especially the resurrection, are used as signs by God to authenticate the messenger. And if they are being used as signs, in the case of the resurrection, to vindicate the divine and messianic self-claims of Jesus, then we wouldn't expect them to be regular occurrences because they have to stand out against regular natural order, right?
No, and I understand that, right? It would have to stand out to be unique, right? It would have to be what Gentry had called singularities, which are one-time miracle type events, kind of things. But just because it wouldn't have to happen all the time, 2,000 years is a long time. And so wouldn't it make sense that every dispensation, every generation, there'd at least be something where God could continue? God's been pretty silent for 2,000 years.
Well, a lot of people would argue that, I mean, Craig Keener, for example, wrote a 2-volume set arguing, basically documenting miracle claims from around the world. So, I mean, David Hume's argument that that the uniform repeated experience of humans argues that there are no miraculous occurrences, and therefore we should discount the resurrection and other miraculous claims because it goes against the uniform repeated experience of humans. But the argument is circular because he has to discount all of the miracle claims from around the world on the basis of the fact that that it goes against the uniform repeated experience of humans, right?
Well, so, yeah. Except that we when we go investigate these types of experiences, I mean, almost always we're able to find a naturalistic explanation. And again, not always, and I wouldn't expect them to be. I mean, I would expect that there are certain things that we just don't have enough information for. For example, like I'm a big fan of tornadoes. I love tornado watching. I mean, I just love watching those videos. I even had a dream about being in a tornado last night because I was probably watching some videos the other day. But for example, not long ago, we didn't understand sprites and jets and things that came out of these huge mesocyclones. We didn't know anything about them, right? These flashes of red light, and some of them were green, and by the way, I think they're called Steve, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, I didn't name them, but they're flashes of green light called Steve. But we didn't know about them, right? They were undiscovered. And so again, because we want to be able to explain things as sentient creatures, that we just may not have enough knowledge to be able to explain certain things. And I think that a lot of it is just, we haven't gotten to that place yet. And I'm wondering, like 10,000 years from now, if Christianity will even be a thing, right? Would you agree that it's a 10,000 years from now? Let's say the world has moved on, has been devastated by some kind of asteroid, because that's inevitable. The population's wiped down to you and a group of lone people trying to forage and survive. Do you think you would still have the Christian belief?
In how many years? In 10,000 years?
Yeah, let's say that you popped ahead. You were able to send you 10,000 years in the future.
Yeah, I mean, if the evidence was as it is today, assuming that there would be no further discoveries that would be sufficient to disconfirm my Christian belief, then yes, I would still.
Well, what's the time frame for Jesus to come back? I mean, he was supposed to come back, I thought 2,000 years ago, but every generation seems to be, oh, he's come back this generation. That's been going on for hundreds if not thousands of years.
I don't believe that the gospel account. I don't believe Jesus in the gospel accounts gives us a definite timeline, so it's an unknown.
Yeah, no, and I think that even Jesus mentioned he doesn't know the time either, the exact time and date. But I thought that they had at least a relative time frame, right? Because 2,000 years is a long time to wait. I mean, the Jews thought it would be, from what I understand, the Jews thought it would be within their generation.
You mean the Christians? You mean
no, that was the Jews that thought. Well, not Christians. The Jews thought a Messiah would come in their generation. They didn't accept Jesus as Messiah, but they thought that some Messiah figure would come for them. Did they not?
Do you mean the first century Jews?
First century Jews.
Yeah, I mean, there were various messianic claimants in the first century. It was definitely a time of expectation because there was this widespread belief that the Messiah would overthrow the Romans and
right, exactly,
monarchy and so forth. Yeah. But Jesus himself, I would argue, although some scholars would disagree, many scholars would disagree, but I would argue that Jesus doesn't give us a time frame in regards to the second coming. And I think that the texts that are often interpreted as indicating that he was a failed apocalyptic prophet are misinterpreted.
10,000 years is a long time. I mean, in fact, if we started like doing star travel and we went to other planets, and let's say the Earth was destroyed, because again, physically speaking, the Earth has a limited lifespan. I don't think anybody will say that the universe, the Earth is going to be around forever, even from at least from a physical point of view, right? Some believe it'll be translated, some believe it'll be celestial or whatever. But I mean, from a physical point of view, the Earth has a limited life expectancy. So let's say that there's no Earth is no longer here, and man has long since gone to the stars. I don't see religion even being out there. I don't see it continuing with mankind at that point. If our scientific advancements have been so great that we're able to explain certain things we weren't able to explain before, I don't think there's a need for people to try to come up with other alternative explanations. That doesn't mean that people won't. And again, I'm not trying to say that people aren't entitled to have those explanations for themselves. And I think it's perfectly rational for theists to have those explanations. I don't begrudge them or fault them for that at all. But is it something that is going to be something in society, or something that will dissipate over a period of time? I think that the way it's going is it's probably going to dissipate over time, unless God does something to go, hey, look, I am here, and come check me out. Because again, what's the point of being hidden from us? I don't think this faith-based condition to say, look, believe me or you're going to hell, is very convincing. Matter of fact, I will say it just straight out. I believe that hell doesn't exist. I believe that at least the Christian version of hell, right? I don't believe the fire and brimstone. That to me makes no sense whatsoever. I believe that's just story thing that they came up with for the Catholic Church to try to convince people. Now, is it possible to have some kind of isolation from God? Okay, sure. I'm agnostic on that particular point. But don't you think that as we learn things, that people overall will say, hey, look, we need more than this. We need more evidence than this. And I don't think it's wrong to ask for some kind of evidence in that. I'm not an evidentialist. I'm not trying to be. But if God is going to say, hey, look, I want you to believe in me, and if you don't, you're going to hell, there needs to be a little bit more to it, or else I don't think that's going to be very fair for God to put somebody in that position.
So just to clarify, you said you're not an evidentialist. So what
I tend to weak evidentialism for the most part. I have a hard time with Clifford's principle.
Okay.
And so I'm definitely not a strong evidentialist. I think that's the wrong way to go. Weak evidentialism at most. And I doubt you'd be much of a strong evidentialist.
I'm a strong evidentialist.
Are you? That's surprising.
I adhere to a modified version of Clifford's principle, but
okay. Well, and there's some modifications of Clifford's principle that seem to make more sense. How about empiricism? Do you subscribe to strict empiricism?
No, I'm not scientistic or empiricistic. Right.
Yeah, because I'm great for empiricism in the realm of science. I think it's incredibly most powerful tool we have for acquiring knowledge in that domain. But as soon as you leave science, using empiricism makes very little sense when you have other things like rationalism and pragmatism and prudentialism and other ways to acquire knowledge. And I think that what people do is they go so fixated in science, because we all love science. I know you really love science. And as a theist, that's you find a way to compatibilize those. That's great. But we all love science. And so when we start using scientific terms outside of science for philosophy, I think that becomes detrimental to our epistemic.
And of course, as you well know, scientism is self-refuting, right? It's self-referentially incoherent, because scientism, or the statement that all truth is acquired through science, that itself is not a statement of science, it's a statement of metaphysics or philosophy.
Yeah, correct. That is a philosophical
and therefore, if it's true, it's false. So that's the problem with that.
Yeah, the same issues I have with verificationism and
right.
issues against logical positivism. Absolutely,
right.
Yes.
Exactly. So coming back to the points you just raised, so you said that, so 2,000 years is a long time, and does that not count? One of the points you made was, does that not count as evidence against Christianity because we've waited so long in crisis?
Yeah, how long ago can we find this to be the case that people have said this? If 10,000 years in the future, these things have long become myth.
So I would argue, I think, that at best that might be weak evidence that tends to disconfirm Christianity. But I would argue that because Christ, in my judgment at least, didn't give us a clear time frame on when to expect him, then it should not sufficiently counterbalance the positive reasons that tend to confirm Christianity, such as the case for the resurrection, predictive prophecy, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, it would be weak evidence. No, I do agree with that. But I do think it'd be weak evidence that to oneself going, if God it does exist, and I think that he hasn't reasserted himself in some way over 10,000 years, it's not strong evidence, but it's it's strong weak evidence. How about that? It's because it can't be strong evidence, but it certainly could be weak evidence that, as an aggregate of everything else, goes, maybe it is more unlikely. At least to the point to not accept the hypothesis. Again, I'm looking from an agnostic position, right? I'm not just confirming to the point where I say that these things are false. And I think that's a distinction that needs to be made, because a lot of people who claim to be atheist, and they use that term atheist, which are perfectly fine to do, they're agnostic on the proposition, right? And that's just a philosophical term, right? I'm not trying to label them. They are agnostic on the proposition. They're just calling it atheism, which is a matter of semantics.
So just to clarify, would you say that you're agnostic with respect to the truth of Christianity as well as theism?
I probably more atheist when it comes to Christ himself, being the Son of God. However, the Christian God, the different ways of looking at a Christian God from a metaphysical standpoint that must exist in all possible worlds as a metaphysical accounting, I would be agnostic on.
Right. So you would be agnostic with respect to the proposition of generic theism.
Correct.
But atheist with respect to the proposition that the God of Scripture exists. Is that fair?
Certain views of it. Obviously, like the view of Scripture that the Young Earth creationists take, that you and I both know, obviously is, conceptually flawed from the get-go. But they take a hyper literal approach to the Bible, right? They'll be like, "Hey, the Bible's true, therefore we're going to believe every single word of it in a very literal sense," which again is not even how linguistics works. But by doing so, they've come to a false conclusion, which is demonstrably false, right? It's not a matter of faith at that point. It's not a matter of my subjective evaluation of a claim. It is, I am believing that 2 + 2 = 5. And we know that objectively that is incorrect. We can objectively verify their position as being incorrect. And it's hard to do that for any kind of faith-based things, right? If God exists, I don't know what the objective evaluation would be. And it's unfortunate because if the Bible didn't exist, right, there's no such thing as the Bible, how would you go about objectively coming to the conclusion that Christ is the Son of God? Not that God exists. I mean, you might have some kind of intuition approach, and I actually like intuitionism. But how would you come to the conclusion that Christ was the Son of God if there wasn't ever this book that existed to tell you this?
Well, then, in that case, there would not, in my opinion, be sufficient grounds for believing that proposition to be true. Mm-hmm. So if there were no Bible, then I wouldn't have sufficient grounds for believing it, and so I wouldn't believe it. In fact, if there were no Bible, I would almost certainly never have heard of Jesus.
Right, and I agree with that. So the problem would be how would objectively would somebody go about verifying these types of things, right? And again, I don't think that you have to have an objectivist approach. I'm perfectly fine with subjective evaluation, but if I wanted to go to discover myself that God exists, I cannot think of a way to do that objectively. I even when I was a theist, I never really felt that connection, right? You hear people saying, "Oh, once you become a Christian or something like that, you feel as love and all this other stuff." Never felt any of that. Sure, there was some feelings of good and things of that and happy, but a lot of this can be contributed to biological and brain chemical states, and I have no issue with that either. But how would I determine that Christ is the Son of God? I mean, it's just this one book that says this. And as somebody who wants to go, okay, I want to objectively verify this. Why wouldn't God tell me?
Well, the Bible is not one book, as you know, right? It's
66, yes.
Yeah, 66. But and the New Testament specifically, which is the primary set of documents that talks about Jesus, is 27 different books. And I would argue that we can use tools of historical inquiry to investigate whether the Gospels and Acts and so forth are grounded in substantially reliable eyewitness testimony. And I would argue that the Gospels and Acts are demonstrably written by people who are close up to the facts and habitually reliable. And so that would anchor the claims concerning the nature and variety of the resurrection encounters with Jesus in substantially credible eyewitness testimony, right?
You don't want more than that. I mean, again, I understand faith-based, right? And I believe it's more the pistis approach, where it's having faith that God is going to do right by you and good and all these other things. It's not a matter of just blind faith, although I do think that we all have some kind of blind faith in things. I probably basic belief is blind faith, unfortunately. But if you had the opportunity for God to manifest Himself to you, to Christ to visit with you personally, wouldn't you want something like that? Because I don't think you've ever made that claim that you and Christ ever sat down for lunch, right?
So just going back for a moment to the previous thing you said about the nature of faith. So um, I believe that faith is something which is supposed to be grounded in evidence. So the more evidence I have for a proposition, the more inclined I am to put my faith in it, to put my trust in it.
Okay, and that's is that something that's typical? Because usually Christians will be, faith is just being that it's not blind faith, but you're relying on God, you're trusting Him. It's trust.
So Hebrews 11:1, when it says faith is the substance of things hoped for, the conviction of things unseen. The way I would interpret that, and I think I can defend this contextually, is that that we are to trust, that faith is trusting God to fulfill His future promises in view of His past faithfulness. And so in the same way that a man on his wedding day trusts his spouse to fulfill her wedding vows, even though he hasn't seen her do so yet because it's still future, but nonetheless he trusts that she will because of his
experience. No, I'm okay with that. I've heard other people, it's very similar. It's a matter of, again, you trust God, that he'll if God promised you something that you have trust, he'll as an obligatory thing, as a duty, that as some kind of a promise to you, that he'll fulfill that, right? Okay,
for sure. And on basic beliefs, I think dispute that basic beliefs are blind faith. So
you dispute that?
Yeah, I would dispute that. So for example, I by the way reject Alvin Plantinga's Reformed epistemology view, which I do too. So and part of the reason I reject that is because I don't think it's normative for Christians to have an inner witness testimonial experience which is sufficient to warrant belief that Christianity is true. I certainly don't have that. And so my belief is rooted entirely in the public evidence, right?
Okay. Yeah, no, I get that. Yeah, Reformed epistemology to me, again, I had initially had said that Plantinga, I think, identifies as something as a basic belief, but not properly basic, because we don't all need to, it's a reality. We don't all need to believe in God to have function in society. It's not properly basic. I need to believe that you exist, or I'm going to be talking to myself, right? You're an external mind. If I'm a solipsist, then what am I doing here? So there's certain things that on conditions of rationality, on pains of irrationality, I have to accept. And to me, I do think they're faith-based commitments, because there's no evidence either way, right? There's no evidence that you exist as a mind that will weigh it one way or another. There's no experiment I can do that would weigh that hypothesis one way or another. It's just faith, blind faith.
So as a foundationalist like yourself, I would argue that foundational or basic beliefs, such as that the external world exists, that our sensory experiences are giving us an approximately correct interpretation of the world, I would argue that those are not blind faith, that we do actually have justification for that. I would argue that, for example, the prior probability of alternative interpretations is significantly lower than the face value interpretation that our senses are actually giving us an approximately accurate picture of the world.
No, and I think that it does. I think that it is approximate, but we're also filtered through our biological senses, right? I mean, this is one of the things that I talked about a lot on my own channels, that I think we are, unfortunately, biologically limited in our epistemology. And so we cannot comprehend or apprehend certain things because we have physical limitations. We see things through a biological filter. Matter of fact, it was Thomas Nagel that wrote a paper called "What It's Like to Be a Bat," and he argues that we cannot understand what it's like to be a bat. We can put ourselves in that position from our perspective, what it may be like to be a bat, but being a bat itself, we have no ability to do so. The way I would phrase it is we're epistemically blocked, or we're epistemically forever isolated from knowing certain things, right? I don't know. I have no ability to understand what it's like to be a bat. I cannot be a bat. I cannot be anything but what I am. And I think that's a biological issue that we have, that we're hardwired such that we may not be able to apprehend certain things, including the existence of the universe, including the existence of ourselves. Some argue that our mind is incapable of apprehending itself. And I think that might be the case. Right. I mean, you're an evolutionary biologist. Firsthand that our minds are limited. We cannot computationally hold trillions of calculations in our head like some computer can. We have biological limitations. So whatever the answer is, whatever these metaphysical accountings are, we just may not be able to understand it. I mean, it just may be something forever out of our reach. And it's unfortunate, but I tend to brute fact, right? I tend to, we just have some brute fact that we may or may not ever apprehend.
Right. So let's go back then to your
Sure.
question that you asked me about in regards to divine hiddenness, and would I not like something more than documentary evidence? Wouldn't I like it if Jesus and I sat down for lunch? That would be even better evidence, right? And I completely agree that there could, in principle, be better evidence than what we actually have for Christianity. But I would argue that it's a fallacy to say, premise one, if you had evidence X, you would have better evidence to believe. Premise two, you don't have evidence X, concluding therefore you don't have sufficient evidence, or you don't have good evidence for your Christian belief. I would argue that what we've been given is sufficient. And while I would like to have a more firsthand personal experience like the one you described, that would be a reflection of my discontentedness with the evidence that God has actually given me, which I think is sufficient. And is, in fact, in Luke 16, Jesus gives a parable, which I'm sure you're familiar with, where Jesus tells the parable about Abraham and the rich man. The rich man Lazarus and the rich man and Lazarus. So the rich man in Luke 16 dies, and Lazarus, the beggar, dies, and Lazarus goes to Abraham's bosom, and the rich man goes to hell or Hades, and he is in torment. And he says to Abraham, he asks Abraham if Lazarus can go to warn his brothers not to come to this place, and Abraham tells the rich man that they have Moses and the prophets, let them listen to them. And the rich man says, well, no, if someone rises from the dead and goes to them, then they'll believe. And the response that he's given is, if they don't listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not believe, even if someone rises from the dead. And so in other words, we could have better evidence. God could have given us better evidence, but what we have been given is sufficient to warrant and justify belief. And so to demand that we have better evidence is to express discontentedness with the evidence we've actually been given, right?
Well, that would be fine for an individual basis, right? I mean, whatever the reasons why you believe, you have met some sufficiency to that. Okay. I mean, it goes hand in hand. If you believe something, you probably have reasons for it. Again, there are unjustified beliefs, but let's talk about warranted and justified beliefs that for whatever reason, you are convinced that the proposition is true. When somebody says like, I don't believe, it's almost axiomatic or tautological that they don't have sufficient evidence to believe, right? Because if they had sufficient to believe, they would believe. So when somebody says, I don't believe because of insufficient evidence, to me, that it's not explanatory. It doesn't tell me a damn thing, right? Because it just says, hey, look, I don't believe because I don't believe. It doesn't tell me anything. But whatever it is that convinced you, right? Whatever was your sufficiency, I think God would recognize that that level differs from person to person. And so if it differs from person to person, your sufficiency level may not be mine, right? And so it seems odd that God would give us enough evidence for you to be convinced, right? But not give enough evidence for somebody like myself, who is a non-resistant non-believer, to be convinced.
But I would argue that what we do have is sufficient to make one irrational if one is fully informed. Then I would argue that it's irrational not to believe.
I don't think you make that leap. I mean, I'll concede that I believe in rational theism, right? I have no problem with that. A lot of people out there are like, oh, theism is irrational. I think that's a hard argument to make. When you have 2 billion people that believe in some form of deity, you're saying that 2 million people are irrational. People have reasons why. When I was a theist, I was never irrational. I mean, I had reasons why I believe God exists, right? To be irrational means that you don't have reasons, or worse, you have bad reasons. There are some people that are rational that don't have justification but still believe. They're called theist, right? So they're not necessarily irrational, right? They just don't have sufficient reason to believe, but they believe anyways.
So you agree that someone can be presented with sufficient evidence and not be rational, and thus they reject the conclusion?
Yes, if the case is something like there's an objective fact of the matter to be had, right? I mean, I use what I call a litmus test of objectivity. And one of the things I use for a litmus test about objectivity is 0.99 repeating equals 1. People say, why do you love that math thing? And it's not so much that I find it interesting. I took calculus and I understand how to prove that in numerous different ways, and I have. But what I use it for is to determine whether a person is objectively a critical thinker or not. Because if you're going to deny an objective fact, right, an objective analytical fact, then how am I going to have a discussion with them on objective morality or any kind of discussion, right? Because they're literally telling me something that is objectively the case is not the case, right? It might as well say A doesn't equal A. It just, to me, is not rational. It is irrational to say something that you can prove mathematically is not the case. But when it comes to subjectivity, why this is on a subjective evaluation of what we believe to be the case for sufficient justification to hold a proposition true or false, right? And so you have sufficient justification to believe the proposition is true. I don't feel that I do. People that are self-prescribed atheists, they don't feel that they do. And again, I think some of them are atheists in the philosophical sense, and some of them are agnostics in the mixed terminology, which gets really confusing. I do think a lot of them probably are somebody that believes the proposition is false, but they don't want to take the burden to try to give argumentation for that, which I think is unfortunate, because I think a lot of people probably do have very strong reasons why they believe God does not exist, but they don't want to get into it. They don't want to give those reasons. But that, to them, they've met the sufficiency, right? To them, for an atheist who will say, look, there are no gods, they believe they're justified. Would you not agree?
They believe that they're justified, yeah, but that doesn't mean that they're rationally justified.
Well, I mean, if they believe that they are and they have sufficient reason to them, I mean, it's a subjective evaluation if there's no objective matter to be had. It's hard to say that they're irrational in that, right? Because I don't find them to be irrational. I find that to be a very rational position. I mean, if I'm going to say that theism is rational, why would I not say that having the opposite of that, the negation of that, not to be rational?
So let's take a position that we both agree is false.
Sure.
Take, for example, young Earth creationism. Do you think that people are both fully informed and rational in accepting young Earth creationism to be true?
I think the majority of them are rational because they've been presented objective evidence, right? I mean, a lot of them will even say, hey, there's two things that I find to be irrational when it comes to that. One, statement of faith. Okay. When somebody says, look, there's no amount of evidence that can sway me because the earth has to be young, it can be no other way, that automatically takes them out of the realm of science, out of the realm of rationality. They are epistemically closed-minded. In virtue epistemology, that's called closed-mindedness. They're not rational in that position, because now they're just talking about, hey, look, my faith supersedes anything that you can show me, and I don't think that's an approach that we should take for what we would consider to be an ingredient for rationality. And the other thing is that the people that have that young Earth creationist belief, they do so for religious reasons, right? They don't do it for scientific reasons. I've never met a young Earth creationist that will say, I'm a young Earth creationist because of the science, without the religion. I mean, I've talked to them all. I mean, I know Humphreys, and I've talked to correspondence with Austin, and I talked to Safadi. I know a lot of these young Earth creationists, but I don't think any of them would be young Earth creationists without religiosity, right? If they didn't believe that the Bible was something that told them the earth was 6,000 years old from that, none of them would ever look at the science and conclude it. I just don't think that would happen. Do you?
That is correct.
Okay.
Although I could give you quotations from atheists to a similar effect, like you.
Sure, by all means, yes. Me, I'll criticize an atheist as much as I will a theist any day of the week. I'm hard. Look, I'm harder on atheists because I hate to say this, but they're part of my tribe, right? I'm a non-believer, and so when an atheist makes some stupid statement, I'm a little bit more harder on them, because I'm like, what are you thinking? Why would you say something so bizarre?
So, for example, here's Richard Lewontin, very famous evolutionary biologist. This is a very well-known quote, so you're probably familiar. But he says, our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community to unsubstantiated just those stories, because we have a prior commitment to materialism. It's not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced to by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts to produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. The eminent Kant scholar Louis Beck used to say that anyone who could believe in God could believe in anything. To appeal to an omnipotent deity is to allow that at any moment the regularities of nature may be ruptured, the miracles may happen. So that's an example of a scientist who rejects the proposition of theism, and not for seemingly rational reasons, but rather for a priori commitments.
Yeah, right? There's two things I'll say. That one, obviously, I do think that scientists do have a prior commitments, but I think it's only in the terms of we would not want to have science that could allow for any kind of supernatural causation, because that's not what science does. Science looks at an observation and recognizes it to be a natural phenomenon to find a natural explanation for it. If we did not exclude or even preclude the supernatural as a causation, we could posit anything as anything, right? Why is there a rainbow? Well, because a leprechaun's hiding this gold at the end of the rainbow. We eliminate that by fiat, and those are something that is a priori just done, right? It's not through observation. It's just axiomatically we've said these are not going to be the cases where we even allow for certain things for an explanation. And that's fine in science. Science is not the domain for those things. So I don't have a problem with adhering to the naturalism or to physicalism or materialism in that regard. But I do think that they go an extreme. I think when they move from methodological naturalism as saying we cannot have a supernatural causation to there is no supernatural causation, I think that then they've necessarily jumped the shark. Would you agree on that? Oh, did I lose your sound?
I'm sorry. It was me.
Okay.
I would agree. I would argue that there can be some cases in science where a non-naturalistic explanation is actually warranted by the evidence. So, for instance, when we're dealing with information content in the cell, I would argue that information content is more probable given the proposition of design than given the falsity of design. So it does constitute evidence of design. Would you agree with that? Or
no? And the reason is I do think there are certain things that are non-naturalistic. I tend to non-naturalistic morality, like in a Morean type sense. And again, that's not supernatural. That has nothing to do with supernatural. A non-natural sense is that you just cannot reduce, as far as a reductionist approach, good to any kind of moral value or anything like that. Anything that goodness is not reduced to happiness or something along those lines, right? And I think that's a proper way to go. But when it comes to intelligent design, then you're talking about the difference between teleological and teleonomic, right? You're talking about the appearance of design, whether there was some kind of intentional being that deliberately designed something. And Darwin, in Origin of Species, he pretty much, if people ask what's the greater contribution Darwin ever made, I tell them I think it is that he was able to explain something teleonomically versus teleologically, which doesn't mean that is the case, right? I'm not arguing it must be that way because Darwin explained it that way, but it gave an option. It said, look, we don't have to have this teleological explanation any longer. We don't have to have a God to explain this. It doesn't mean that God couldn't have done that way, but it just meant that we didn't need that explanation. We had another explanation that worked very well. And so when we look at something to design, when we have to look at priors, we have to say to ourselves, okay, what is it about design that we recognize? Well, one, when we see things that are designed, we've seen priors of human things doing these things, right? We've never seen a disembodied mind, and I'm going to just arguendo, consider God a disembodied mind. We've never seen them do anything. We've never seen them have any kind of interaction with anything. We've never seen them produce anything. We don't even know how the causal mechanism would work. However, when it comes to like creating an arrowhead, we've seen humans do this. So if we walk along the beach and we see a stone that looks like an arrowhead, we say, hey, look, it might be something that is intentionally designed, because we've seen that before. We have a priors of that. So when looking at the cell, sure, there's some really cool stuff in the cell, man. I got to admit, microbiology is fascinating. Complex beyond our imagination. But what is it that makes it that there was some kind of intentional being that created that?
We also haven't seen natural selection produce the types of systems that we find in the cell, the types of molecular machines at the nanoscale. We haven't seen natural selection craft the sort of technology that we find in the cell, such as flagella and replisomes. And
well, we've seen the iterations. I mean, we can trace back. I mean, I'm not much in the flagellum, but I remember quite a little bit about ATP synthase. We've seen the precursors of ATP synthase through ATPases, and we've seen the F naught and the F1. We've seen how these things have been developed over time from prior iterations, which again, natural selection isn't the be all end all. I'm sure Photo's argument that natural selection doesn't really explain anything. Mm-hmm. And there's some actually significant arguments to be had for and against that. What does natural selection really explain? But we combine that with other things. I mean, as just recently in our lifetimes, the development of, evo devo, the development of epigenetics, and I hate when theists misuse that word. Sure, you do too. But they've discovered things that Darwin have no way of knowing. Matter of fact, Darwin didn't really. I mean, they had discovered DNA during his time, but he didn't. He thought these things were more of a blended thing than a particulate rather than blended kind of thing. And so, if Darwin would have been like today, right? If we had that kind of mind today, I think he would be just fascinated by this. But would he go back to thinking that, oh, look, there had to be a God to design this? I'm not quite sure that he would. I think it'd be the opposite. I think he'd be more convinced that it was teleological, or it should be teleonomic versus teleological.
Yeah, that's one thing on which I would disagree with you. I think that if Darwin was alive today, I think he would be more swayed by the design arguments.
That would be amazing, though, wouldn't it? I would love. I mean, obviously, there's no way to determine the objectivity of that fact, but it would be interesting to see.
Yeah, but I mean, there's objective facts about the cell which I think make the Darwinian scenario quite improbable. I'm sure you're familiar with some of these, but for example, the rarity of protein structures in combinatorial space, given the sequence space, 150 amino acid long amino acid residue, you've got 20 to the 150th power possible ways of arranging those amino acids. And there's research that's been done. Doug Axe is the most famous example, but there's other work as well. In addition to that, some of it published in mainstream journals, which argues that the ratio of stable and functional protein structures within that combinatorial space is astronomically small. And it seems then implausible that by a Darwinian search you'd be able to stumble upon the functional and stable protein structures. And then there's population genetics, I think, which creates mathematical headaches for the neo-Darwinian standard scenario of natural selection and random mutation, given the timeframes allowed by the fossil record, the irreducible complexity that we observe, especially things like DNA replication and cell division, which seem to be irreducibly complex, and yet you can't reduce them without not having a cell that's viable anymore. So it seems to me that certainly cumulatively, considering all these systems together, it would mean that the prior probability of design would have to be so astronomically small to overcome it, that I am inclined to think that even in view of a small prior, it's sufficient to establish a design inference.
Yeah, these are problems that have yet to be overcome. I mean, before modern computing, they thought the protein folding problem would be impossible to resolve. Now they think it might be. Especially if we resolve things like NP equals P, and we have computational power that could do things in polynomial time, protein folding could be modeled, right? I mean, that basically was limited by computational power, if I'm not mistaken. But way back when, sure. I mean, it would be like, this is so complicated that, obviously a mind must have created it. And, I'm not a biologist, so I don't know the nuances. I mean, I'm fascinated by biology, but you're probably right. The chances of certain proteins forming, especially on their own, I would say nil. I mean, you're going to have these amino acid chains just come together. Sure, in maybe small cases, but we understand now that we have a ribosome that makes them, right? Before we had of course we had no idea how is a peptide made, if they even knew what a peptide was. But we understand that this machinery does work. We understand that there are iterations of even ribosomes going back, from eukaryote to prokaryotes, and the subunits that differ from modern eukaryotes to ancient prokaryotes. And so we see those iterations. Now, if you go back far enough, and you seem to be taking a reductionist approach, but I think reductionism gets into a wall in many cases. I think that you're eventually reach a point where the lines are so blurred that I don't even know what reductionism would be at that point. The mind-body problem, for example, a very hard problem to have a reductionist approach to physical things, right? I tend to non-physical reductionism, or non-reductive physicalism. But, even then, it's hard to say, why do we have mental states based upon strictly physical states? And I think that the same thing happens in biology. Eventually, when you have this reductionist approach, we just don't know. There are unknowns. And I don't think that filling it in with, an intelligent mind must have done this is necessary. Now, is it possible? Yes. Is it something that I think we should research? I have no problem with that. I am not an anti-ID person as far as I don't think that they should just say, look, it's all nonsense and forget about it, like I do Young Earth Creationists. It hasn't gotten to that point yet. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But for me, I when I look at the cell and I look at the biology and say, hey, look, I find it fascinating. But I don't find it to be the case where, okay, there has to be some kind of intelligent design for this. And that differs from your level, right? Your level is that you looked at it and you think there is intelligent design, but somebody who has the same qualifications as you may not come to the same conclusion. So again, I don't think there's a really objective matter to be had there.
So to clarify why I think it's not a God of the gaps argument,
No, and I don't think it is either. I don't want to pause it as a God of the gaps.
Sorry, because the way you presented it.
I didn't mean to. I probably did, but no, I don't want to posit it as a God of gaps. We don't know, therefore God. I don't think that's what intelligent design do.
Okay.
I think that they do base it upon evidence, and I do think they based upon, hey, look, these things do have some kind of appearance of design, but of course we also know that from a teleonomic standpoint, appearance of design exists in nature without having an intelligent agent being the causation.
Okay, so let's suppose, as I think there's sufficient reason to conclude, but you would contest, let's just suppose for the sake of argument that it is the case that naturalistic neo-Darwinian type mechanisms are demonstrably insufficient to account for the complexity that we see in life. Would you agree with me that there is a positive case to be made for design in that circumstance?
Okay, so you're asking if we could determine that there is no possible.
Well, not there's no possible, but there's no plausible.
No, because then at that point, I mean, again, how do we ever reach to the point where you say there's no plausible materialistic explanation? We just may not have the means to understand it yet, or it might be outside of our means. Again,
sure, but we can still reason
believe in epistemic limits.
We can still reason to the best explanation, right?
But isn't it a best explanation? If you're going to use an abductive argument, the best explanation isn't something that says, hey, a disembodied mind done this, because we've never seen a disembodied mind do anything. We've never seen it create anything. In order to have that as an abductive argument, you have to have at least some prior to say we've seen some, not just a mind, not just something that has intentionality and intentional states, but we've seen a mind sans a physicality be able to do these things. And that's something we haven't seen. So I think that's the jump that a lot of people can't make.
But we have seen these sort of effects of minds. There might be embodied minds, but minds nonetheless. We've seen that minds produce information content and functionally integrated systems and so forth. And so we understand the type of thing that a mind might plausibly do. Mm-hmm. And so we can reason, I think, that if a disembodied mind existed, hypothetically, we can reason or infer what a disembodied mind might plausibly be expected to do. Now, I would argue that there's no reason to think that a disembodied mind is logically impossible. There's another question whether it's physically possible.
No, I don't think it's logically impossible, of course. Yeah.
So the prior then would be non-zero. And so in principle,
I'm not going to argue it's physically impossible because we're talking in philosophy, not science, right?
But surely the evidence for design would itself be evidence that it is physically possible.
Well, not necessarily. If I saw, for example, let's say in DNA, right? If I saw in DNA that we could actually look at certain nucleotide sequences and say, hey, look, this has all the star locations for all the major stars, for the first 100 stars next to us. If I could get that information from DNA, that to me would something scream intelligence, right? Like when we launched Pioneer and Voyager and all these other satellites, there's an intelligence there. What was it? Pioneer, that had the record, right? That had, where we were from and different things on the record. That an intelligence agent that finds that, some alien, they're probably going to recognize that as non-natural. They're going to recognize that as something that has information that can be used to determine locality of something like that. That's not something we would expect to find stochastically or randomly. We wouldn't expect that. So if we could find a message in DNA that gives us some information about something else unrelated, I might be with you on intelligent design. But we just don't see that. And I don't think itself that the molecule really contains information per se. I'm not somebody who thinks it's even a code.
You're not someone that thinks it's even a code.
Yeah, but that's a whole different argument.
I mean, obviously you understand that that there's a mapping system, right? That's what the genetic code is, right? It's a
Yeah,
mapping.
but even Crick said it best. He called it a cipher, but cipher didn't sound cool enough. Genetic cipher. So I mean, when it comes to the synthesis, the RNA synthesis, there might be some kind of cipher there. But code to me, I look. I was in the military. To me, code is when it comes to code, it is crypto tech kind of stuff. A code is an intentional thing that we want to conceal things, or we want to be able to encode something for information, like and so there's a difference between code and a cipher. Like Morse code is more of a cipher than it is actually a code. And so unless God was trying to actually code something into the DNA that we could actually take out information about the universe, I wouldn't call it a code. And again, I'm not talking about the RNA synthesis.
Yeah, I mean that's semantics. I mean, it
is. No, absolutely. I agree with you. It's totally semantics. Absolutely, it is.
I mean, I'm not arguing for design on the basis that we use the word code.
Yeah, no.
Right.
And by the way, and I'm grateful for that, because there are people that do that. It drives me nuts, because you're exactly right. That is semantics, whether we call it code or not. I think it really, if you want to talk about DNA being code, let's get into you'd get into more Shannon information. You get into more the complexity of the nucleotides and things of that nature. I'm fine by that. But just because we have the letters, A, T, G, and C doesn't make that necessarily a code to me. But again, it all depends how you want to view it. I'm not. But I'm not going to die on.
It is translated, so to speak, from one language to another. It's transcribed first from DNA into messenger RNA, which is an intermediary molecule, and is taken to the ribosome.
But translation still has a sense of the word, right? I mean, even though there's a translation in the ribosome. It still has a sense of that, right? That doesn't necessarily mean we have there's no little monkeys in the ribosome going, okay, this is going to be the amino acid be attached to this codon kind of stuff, right? There's no intentionality there.
No,
that would be cool.
it is. I mean, it is programmed to translate from the messenger RNA transcript to the polypeptide.
Well, I mean, is a program or just the way the chemicals are? I mean, when you have, again, it's been a long time to look at this stuff, but when you have the tRNA come in with the amino acid, and it puts it in the peptide chain, it's all done by chemistry. It's all done by physiochemical reactions. There's nothing, like I said, there's no monkey in there making the amino acid chain or the peptide chain what it is. There's nobody going, oh, it's this codon, therefore we're going to put this amino acid that attaches to this. And so there's no computer programming either, which is a different sense of the word of code as well.
I don't think it makes a difference whether it's a programmer that does the translating or something else, or like a computer program that does the translating. You're looking at
the end result and the mechanism more than any kind of intentional states behind it, and that might be the case. It's just, again, if it's done by chemistry, if the chemistry is we have chemical laws that make this to be the case, the argument then becomes, okay, it is chemistry doing it, but who programmed the laws of chemistry?
Yeah, but the actual sequence of the nucleotides or the amino acids is not determined by chemistry, right?
So I mean, to a degree, obviously, isn't it? I mean, you have only certain amino acids that can only attach to. If you have whatever codon you have, there's going to be only a certain amino acid that can go to that particular codon, right?
Correct,
codons, because it's going to have more than one that can code for one nucleotide.
But the actual sequence of nucleotides in the DNA or the RNA, or the sequence of amino acids in the polypeptide chain, those are not determined by chemistry. There could be, in principle, any order of amino acids.
Yeah, no, I understand that, and for other species, they're different as well.
Right.
Yeah.
So it is a code in the sense that it carries information which will determine the sequential arrangement of the polypeptide chain, which will in turn fold into a protein based on the properties of the side chains of the amino acids.
Yeah, and again, it's semantics of what we call code. I don't use the word code that way.
Okay.
But do I think that biologically, what you just said? Yes, I agree wholeheartedly. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, and I would argue that that is not particularly surprising. At least it's not astronomically surprising on the hypothesis of design that you would see that, because we've seen designer agents like ourselves produce that type of effect. So it's not hugely surprising that you would see that if on the hypothesis.
It isn't surprising if God did program these things. Honestly, it wouldn't surprise me. It's nothing I'd be like, oh man, that's just so far out there. I'd be like, oh, okay, that makes sense. because you have an intelligent agent did it. Again, it's not something far-fetched to me. I know a lot of people that are like atheists say, oh, it's just so far-fetched that God or some intentional being did that. Well, no, I don't think so. It's just a matter of, is there enough reason to justify that belief?
Okay.
So that's all.
We agree that it's at least not, it wouldn't be surprising on the hypothesis of design or on the
not to me.
of theism. But where we might disagree is the extent to which it's more surprising on the hypothesis of non-design, on the falsehood of design, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, I don't know how you would falsify non-design. I'm not a big falsificationist to begin with. I think Popper was a little. I think the falsification has issues, but let's say that there is a design there. To me, it's more and more likely that we are unique in our physiology based upon DNA by some alien race that created us, rather than a mind body with a mind without a body. There's no likelihood either way, right? We've never seen a mind create anything without a body. We've never seen aliens create anything. But I will tell you, I think it is interesting that, as far as we know, we are the only life in the universe, and we're the only sentient life in the universe. That, to me, is something that needs to be addressed metaphysically, right? That is a question that needs to be addressed by theist and atheist and agnostics. It's something that we have no understanding of. And I believe that maybe we cannot have an understanding of until such time we get some kind of objective fact of the matter to be had.
So the objection that we haven't observed disembodied minds produce these types of effect, therefore we can't infer it as the best explanation, which is how I understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would go with that. Yeah,
I think that's more of a vulnerability of the way that Stephen Meyer develops and constructs the argument. So the way he would construct it is that we have uniform repeated experience of minds producing this sort of effect. We see digitally encoded information content in the world of the cell. Therefore, the best explanation of that is it too was the product of intelligent design, because in every realm of experience of cause and effect, of the cause and effect structure of the world, we find information content associated with minds. It always traces its source back to intelligent cause. And then I think your pushback there, which I think is a potential vulnerability of that argument, is that, well, we've only seen embodied minds produce information content, and so there's an aparallelism there between our uniform repeated experience of embodied minds producing this effect and your inference that a disembodied mind produced the information.
Well, yeah,
content.
if you're going to concede those points, I mean, that it would be a non-disembodied mind. I don't concede Meyer's points, or I don't.
Yeah, so I was
the whole term of digital encoding is kind of odd for communication point of view, right? I mean,
sure.
But I understand why they do it. And by the fact, I did a presentation on using nucleotides as some kind of encoding, as some kind of like binary thing, which is fine. I mean, we can use that type of terminology. But again, I think a lot of this stuff is terminological. I think it's discursory. I don't think a lot of it holds much water as far as does a mind actually create this stuff?
Yeah,
I don't have an answer for that either way.
I was just pointing out that I think that your critique is a stronger one against the way that Stephen Meyer presents the argument than the way I'm presenting the argument. So I'm presenting the argument more as a Bayesian. So I'm saying it's not at all surprising that a mind, whether embodied or disembodied, would produce this type of effect. We observe this type of effect. It seems to be more probable given the hypothesis of design than its falsehood. And we agree, I think, that the prior probability of a disembodied mind is not zero. It might be very low, but it's not zero.
Yeah, it cannot be zero unless they prove it be illogical.
Exactly.
And what I mean by that, there has to be some kind of self-refuting thing.
Right.
If you want to say like square circle, that's self-refuting. So to be zero, to me personally, I just put that as impossible, as a not possible in a possible world.
Right.
With something that is a contradiction.
So we agree on that. So in principle, then you could have a sufficiently top-heavy ratio, that likelihood ratio of the probability of the hypothesis given the evidence against the probability of that same that's the probability of the evidence given the hypothesis against the probability of that same evidence given the falsehood of the hypothesis. That likelihood ratio could in principle be sufficiently top-heavy to overcome the non-zero prior probability, right?
Yeah, and that's what makes it rational. It could, right? And that's why I would never say it's an irrational position.
Sure. Okay. So that in itself then would be evidence in favor of the existence of a disembodied mind.
Oh yeah, well, I'm not saying there's no evidence. I'm not one of the people that say there's no evidence for anything. I really, it drives me nuts when people say there's no evidence.
Right.
Who was it that actually argued that? Oh, what was his name? But somebody was just saying that, and I can't remember his name unfortunately, but they were saying, look, stop arguing. I think it was Dr. McConkie, Dr. McCormick, who wrote for IEP, Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. He argued in one of his papers, stop saying that there's no evidence for one way or another. If there's no evidence one way or another, then everybody would be agnostic, right? There's evidence, obviously, for theism. There's evidence for atheism. It's just a matter of what degree. It's a matter again, I think it's mostly weak evidence. I think it's inductive, right? It's weak inductive evidence. I don't see any real strong deductive evidence in form of the conclusion must follow from the premises. I think these are all inductive arguments. But they're all, you can have an aggregate of weak arguments, but for somebody to say there's no evidence for God, or there's, no evidence for atheism or anything, I think they're missing for the forest from the trees. So I do think there's evidence for intelligent design. Is it strong evidence? No. Do I think it's convincing evidence? No. I'd be an intelligent designer. Do I think it's rational? Yeah. I mean, sure. If there's evidence for something, then there's obviously some degree of rationality to be had for that. Would you agree?
Yeah. So when it comes to when it comes to the systems that we find in the cell, each one of them is some evidence for theism. It's some evidence for design.
Well, let's say it's some evidence for design. How do you then match that to the Christian faith? How does it get you from a mind, which at best some have argued is a deist type approach, to Christianity, that Christ created everything under the auspices of his Father or something like that? So is it his mind that created everything? Is it the Father's mind that created everything? Combination of how do you get that from possible design, to Christianity being true?
I bring in additional arguments to get there. So the arguments for design, I think, are very powerful evidence for the existence of a disembodied mind, and I think that they are therefore dramatically increase the probability of theism, and then I would appeal to additional arguments, notably the case for the resurrection, the argument from predictive prophecy, and so forth, to establish the truth of Christianity, right?
And if it was a disembodied mind, and then you again, I would assume do you subscribe to divine simplicity?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's say there's a mind that is divinely simplistic, has no internal components whatsoever, whatever that comprised. I mean, I don't know what that would mean to be comprised of no primitives or anything, but let's assume that's the case. And so you have this mind, this disembodied mind that still has some kind of intentionality. Again, not sure how that would work, but let's say they have intentional states. They should have the ability to communicate it. Obviously, if they have intentional states, they've communicated in the past. And it all goes back full circle to if I want to communicate with that being, people have said, well, do you do that through prayer? But there's a lot of people like myself who have communicated or tried to communicate through prayer. We haven't had that one-on-one connection. I've never heard the voice of God, and I think most people would agree if they do, there might be, and I would never say theists, are mental or delusional. I think that's a horrible argument. But when everybody says that a theist is delusional, they've taken themselves out of the discourse, because what they're saying is that person has a mind that's not functioning properly, and having a false belief does not entail a dysfunctional mind. But when people do hear voices, we do know that occurs, but I've never heard God talk to me. I've never had a discussion with God, and I'm open to that line of communication, right? And so if he's a disembodied mind that has intentional states, that has the ability to communicate, all he has to do is talk to me. I don't know why he would not want to. I mean, again, you've met sufficiency conditions for yourself to justify it. I haven't, and so why would he not want me to reach that level of sufficiency? Oh, you muted again.
Sorry.
I keep on thinking it's my end, because I mean, you never know with like Zoom and all this stuff. You got mic, I got a preamp, and all this other stuff. You never know what goes wrong.
Yeah. So I would argue that this life is, and Christian thinkers have long argued that this life is a probation, as it were, and that we are we are supposed to investigate investigate why the reason why we're here, And I would argue that God has left sufficient reason or sufficient evidence that is sufficient to compel belief that Christianity is true. And so I would argue that if anyone searches, if anyone seeks out answers to these questions with an open mind and with an objective pursuit of truth, and then I would argue that the man who's fully informed will, in the long run, come to find Christianity to be true and well supported. And as a Christian, I believe that God hears me when I pray, but on the basis of the public historical evidence concerning the resurrection and other evidential factors.
So let me ask you, I know we're getting late here.
Sure.
I'll have to wrap it up soon, but would you not think it's rational? Again, and I'm not going to make the argument if it's possible it's rational. I don't believe in bare possibilities. As Bertrand Russell kind of pointed out, if you believe in every bare possibility, your ontology is bloated to almost infinity kind of thing. So don't you think it's rational though, for somebody to at least say, we as sentient beings want to have explanations, and I'm again not God of the gaps, but we want to have explanations. And one of the things that we fear most is death. And people know by now my mom is now in hospice, and I don't expect her to be around much longer, which has been very detrimental to me and my daughter right now. But we understand these processes happen, and I realize that death is a natural part of living. And as someone like myself who recognizes this, all humanity has gone through this, right? All humanity has dealt with the unknowns when it comes to death. Don't you think it is at least possible that mankind has come up with explanations to try to alleviate the fear of the unknown? Because since nobody really knows, I mean, even no matter how much you believe, I don't think a lot of people can claim it as knowledge, and they certainly couldn't tell us anything about what heaven or hell is actually going to be like. They have, very general ideas, but there's so many more unknowns. If both those places do exist, it's so much to be asked. I mean, what kind of form would you be in? What constitutes you being you? If you died when you were a year old as opposed to when you're 40 or 50 or 60 or my mom's 91. What makes somebody you? What is your essence? What is that makes you that would be in heaven, that has any kind of experience that if you only lived to 1 year of age, right? What makes that you? And so, isn't it possible at least for people to go, look, more likely the case, we are just based upon natural phenomena. We are based upon natural explanations. We are based upon materialism. Again, I'm not a materialist, but it's all because we wanted to have it's all grounded. We wanted to have an explanation of what happens after our death. I think that a lot of religion comes from that. It's a fear of the unknown. Would that not be at least a rational position to take?
Sure, that would be a possibility, but I would argue that it's not, that the possibility of that is not sufficient, I think, to overturn what I consider to be compelling evidential reason to believe Christianity is true.
But wouldn't any religion say that though? I mean, Islam person would say that as well, or Jewish person would say that as well. So to them, that what is going to overturn their position, right? It was going to turn their belief.
So I would argue obviously I think Christianity is a fulfillment of Judaism, so I wouldn't say that Judaism's false.
Not to the Jewish people though, and I'm Jewish by the way, at least culturally.
But in the case of Islam, I would argue that they don't have sufficient reason to believe it's true, and in fact, overwhelming, disconfirming reason to think that it's false.
Yeah, so, and I tend to agree with you on that. I mean, I think that if of all the religions, Islam, I do think is not true, and I think it's false, and I think it's actually detrimental. But it's still based upon people's beliefs that are very similar to the Judeo-Christianic views. And so how do they say Judaic Christian?
Mm-hmm.
Would that be a way? And so they all stem from the same core beliefs thousands of years ago. It's just that one group went one way, one group another way, one group went another way. But again, I think a lot of them stem from the fear of the unknown. Because none of us know. None of us are going to know. And if after we pass, the universe continues on for trillions and trillions and trillions of years until everything gets to be one big black hole, and it existed 3.8 billion years prior to my existence, I have no reason to believe that it won't continue on without me and everybody else that has ever lived. Then I think a lot of this is some explanation is, we want to think that we carry on. We want to believe that there's more. We want to believe that, this is not all there is, that our existence continues. But again, I don't know what that would even mean as far as what makes our existence just that. It's just, if our existence is all sensory, that has been something we've gone through our life learning about, then it would make no sense to say, okay, well, what happens when you don't have these perceptions, these qualia, these sensory things, the sense data? Is that going to exist in heaven? Are we going to remember our lives? And if so, how does that integrate with all the other billions and billions of people that ever lived, and the people that died very young? I don't know what that would even mean.
Sure. And I would argue that although you're quite right that that's a possible explanation for the Christian religion, that's a different question from whether it's the actual explanation. And
well, absolutely, yes. It's like
I would argue that the resurrection, the evidence bearing on the resurrection of Jesus, suggests that the resurrection is the actual explanation for Christianity, and we would differ on that. But I think that would be a legitimate response, because all you've offered is a possibility, not a demonstration that it's the actual explanation.
Oh, of course, yes. But again, going back to priors, all humans have that in common, I think, right? All humans that have ever lived will die. All the humans that have ever lived that have pondered these questions have done so. I mean, I'm not going to say everybody has ever thought about it, but most people that have had a significant amount of time and existence that has ever gotten into any of these philosophical existential questions have pondered these questions in some degree, if they have the capacity to do so. And so if we do now, it makes sense that they did 2,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a reasonable argument to be made.
And I think that there are also ways to raise the probability of the resurrection, and to argue that God possibly has motivation for raising Jesus of Nazareth specifically from the dead. And one way of doing that is to look at messianic prophecy. So, for instance, one undisputable example of fulfilled messianic prophecy is in Isaiah 49 and Isaiah 42, where God says, speaking of the Messiah, that I will make you that it will be a light to the Gentiles, or a light to the nations, that God's salvation will reach to the ends of the earth. And Jesus himself, of course, predicts that the gospel will be proclaimed to all nations, and then the end will come. And so Christianity becoming, this dominant international global religion that it became is quite surprising from this perspective of first century Christians, especially given that for the first until 313 AD, where Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, which guaranteed religious freedom. Until then, Christianity was a persecuted minority, and it seemed inconceivable that Christianity would become eventually the state religion of the empire, and then that would facilitate its dissemination across the world. But on the hypothesis Christianity is true, that's very expected. It's very unsurprising. Actually, the probability is approaching 1, because the Old Testament and the New Testament actually predict that to be the case. So when the hypothesis Christianity is true, that's exactly what you would expect. So although I don't think it's sufficient on its own to establish Christianity is true. I think that it's a top heavy Bayes fact. It's a top heavy likelihood ratio, or a Bayes factor greater than 1. I would argue that is actually quite significantly greater than 1, and therefore it's an evidence that tends to confirm Jesus' messianic identity. Another example is Jesus' death coinciding with the Feast of Passover, given the theological import of that, because Jesus is supposed to be our New Testament concept is Jesus' fulfillment of the Passover lamb, because in the Exodus, if you recall, the Israelites were to smear the blood of lamb on their doorposts, and as the angel of death would pass over their homes and observe the blood, he would leave the firstborn untouched and not killed. And so Christ is the fulfillment of the Passover lamb, because when God looks at the blood, figuratively speaking, that's smeared upon our hearts, he passes over us, and we don't bear his judgment. So Christ is a fitting fulfillment of the Passover lamb imagery, and his death coincides with the day of Passover, as can be demonstrated historically. And that's something which seems to be less surprising, given the hypothesis that Christianity is true, that Jesus really is the Jewish Messiah. It's something which I think is more probable given the messianic identity of Jesus and its falsehood. And so again, you have another piece of evidence. You can build that argument cumulatively, and building it cumulatively, you can argue that God has plausible motivation for raising Jesus of Nazareth specifically from the dead, because there are already independent reasons to suspect perhaps Jesus really is the Jewish Messiah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I would think that would be an awesome second discussion dealing, if I could, bringing somebody who can deal with the historicity of
Sure.
the proliferation of Christianity through historical times, because I do think a lot of it was forceful. I think a lot of it was argumentative ad baculum, believe this or suffer the penalties and the consequences, and I think that's how a lot of the concepts of hell came about. But the second greatest popular religion is Islam, and then before that, I think after that is actually non-believers, if I'm not mistaken. And so, to them, they're going to say, look at all these adherents of Islam. And by the way, they're a lot more fanatic in their beliefs than even some Christians. And so to them, it's absolutely true. There's no deviation from that. There's nothing that can sway them. And even in the Christian sect, there are people that you and I both agree are wrong about their secular beliefs, right? Their beliefs about the universe. It's just fundamentally wrong. And so the proliferation of Christianity doesn't necessarily to me imply anything, because if they have some fundamental misunderstandings about things, then how am I going to even try to convince myself that they're right when they can't even get some things that I know they're not right on? And I understand you don't fall into that, and I respect you a lot for that. The fact that you're able to speak out against the other creationists, because they're blight on theists. I mean, it's the same way flat earthers are a blight on science. They're just so fundamentally wrong, but they are in fact Christians. And so, you have to take the bad with the good. And so a lot of people would be like, why would I want to be in that category of people that believe these things that we know are demonstrably false, right? And it's hard, because again, I don't want to be associated with a lot of atheists for that very same reason. I think see atheists make some very fundamental
like mythicism, for example. I mean, mythicism I would consider to be the young earth creationism of atheism.
Yeah, and I tweeted that out before. I've said this kind of the same thing. And again, I'm not really heavy into the Bayesian. I've talked to Carrier about this very topic, but I'm not convinced by his arguments. Most people aren't. I know there are a handful of people, that have been convinced of it, but but if you read like Bart Ehrman, him and Carrier, gone after it, but I think Robert Price, has talked about mythicism, obviously. But I'm not convinced by that. I think mythicism is not the way to go. I think that everybody that I respect and that I know knows about historical context of the Bible from a history perspective has denounced mythicism in the same way, right? So they would be, like you said, a blight on atheism to that regard. But again, a lot of those atheists that hold to mythicism are the same ones that say, well, we just don't believe. We just don't believe you. I'm not going to say that you're wrong, and I'm not going to put forward an argument. I'm just going to sit here and go, I don't believe you. I mean, that's not how you have a discussion. That to me is just as bad as young earth creationism, epistemologically speaking, at least.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, maybe it'd be a good place to finish here. And thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Yes, this was a very enjoyable, very pleasant conversation. These are things I like to do, is have these types of discussions. So I thank you very much for it.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciated the cordialness of the discussion, and you clearly brought some thoughtfulness to the table, and I really appreciate that. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right, and I will close up the live stream here. Thanks everyone for joining, and if you haven't done so already, please hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you in a later video. Thanks for watching. Okay, we're off air.